If you're telling a certain story, a brand story with your marketing, and then you get onto that sales call where you're talking with that accredited investor or financial advisor, you want the sales pitch to really mirror that existing brand story that they've heard, that existing pitch that they've heard, because if it's incongruent or inconsistent, that's not going to facilitate trust or facilitate an ultimate investment. So I would say you can definitely hire out professional help, people that are experts in specific functions. You can even hire an expert to help you develop that brand story. And that might be money very well spent. But I don't think it's something that you can just check this off your list and say, I've hired a marketing agency, so I don't need to think about marketing anymore.
Marketing to accredited investors. That is something we are all trying to get better at, it seems. But it's difficult, right? As we're operators, we're doing all these things. Well, who am I supposed to hire next? How am I supposed to build culture? How am I supposed to find the next deal? Oh, wait a minute. Oh, yeah. We need to be marketing at the same time, right? Somebody's got to be focused on that or help us. And I've just reached out to a lot of different people and tried to learn better marketing skills. And it's not been easy because it's just not been my personal focus. However, and Andy, welcome to the show. I know you are really good at this. I'm looking forward to diving in and how you all are doing this well. Welcome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Really excited to dive in because, as you said, there are so many owner operators and fund sponsors who become marketers, by default. It just sort of comes with the territory, but they didn't necessarily go into this thinking, oh, I want to be a marketer.
Yeah, you got to get in front of people, right? You do have to put yourself out there, and there's, I guess, good and bad ways to do that, no doubt about it, or better ways to approach those things, which I'm looking forward to diving into. Andy, tell us a little more about your all's business, your focus, and then I want to dive into your all's marketing strategies and how you are attracting more accredited investors. But who's Andy? And let's dive into your all's business.
Yeah, absolutely. So I'm the co-founder of AltsDB. So we are the alternative investment database at altsdb.com. And essentially we are media. We are independent media covering the alternatives industry in the United States. And so our target audience is high net worth investors, along with wealth managers, RIAs, financial advisors, and family offices. So as media, that's our audience, essentially, is accredited investors and the wealth managers who assist them. Now, how we make money, our actual, business, we have a podcast called the Alternative Investment Podcast. Actually, if you just Google alternative investment or even get into iTunes and search alternative investments, we pop up like number 1 or 2. So we get a lot of, traffic to our show, and it's a blast. I love hosting that show. But how we make money in our business model is we run investor events. And so twice a year, we have the Alts Expo, which is an online event, and we call it a matchmaking event. So it's basically on the left-hand side, we have accredited investors along with financial advisors and family offices who are looking to place capital into alternative investments. So they show up. And then on the right-hand side, we have funds, alternative investment funds, heavily weighted towards private equity and real estate specifically, that are essentially pitching their funds to these investors. And, I'm actually a marketing guy. What I studied in school, studied a lot of marketing, and then really my entire career was marketing, but finance was always a passion of mine. So I guess maybe it was meant to be that I've ended up in this intersection of investing and finance where it intersects with marketing, because by running these events and running the podcast, I've seen so many funds and how they do marketing. And really with the alternative investment universe, it's a whole different world than it was 20 years ago. 20 years ago, most alternative investments were not really marketing directly to the consumer. They weren't doing direct solicitation. And it's really only been the advent of the 506c private placement offering, where a lot of these funds now, they kind of skip that broker-dealer channel and they're out directly marketing to the retail investor. And when I say retail investor, I do mean accredited investor. So, it's all kind of a matter of perspective. But in the alternative investment landscape, that is the retail market, is the self-directed accredited investor. And so, working with all these funds, I've seen some of them do things so well in terms of their funnel and their marketing. Some of them have a few pieces in place that they're really, really good at, and a few pieces that maybe they're not so good at. And my thing is strategy, right? I don't necessarily obsess over every little teeny tiny tactic, but I like to think big picture. So I think that's what we're going to talk about today, is kind of that big picture strategy stuff.
Yeah, that's awesome. And I appreciate that background too. It's interesting how, and you just mentioned, when the laws change, this 506C stuff started, right? It's like, well, all of a sudden it changed who we were marketing to, right? Or how we were marketing, or, all of a sudden the accredited investors are a lot bigger focus, right? On our, who we're marketing to anyway. So I'm looking forward to diving in here. Well, so let's jump in. I'm sure you all have a process, right? Or a step-by-step process, or maybe a way you can help us, the listener and I, to think through our process or some things that we may not have in place as a sponsor. Why don't you just get us started? Start kind of basic, and maybe we'll dive into some specific things as well.
Sure. Yeah. I actually outlined this ahead of time. So I have 6 steps for your listeners today, but I want to zoom out to kind of set the table, which is just, you have to start with that strategy. You have to start with that high level plan, that mental framework, paradigm, whatever you want to call it. You have to have that in mind. In my experience, if you are a sponsor and you have this strategy down, the tactics, I don't want to say they don't matter, but they matter a whole lot less, because as an operator, every real estate owner operator knows this. Everybody has a weak spot, right? Everybody has their strengths going into a deal, their strengths, the way they operate. And then generally, if you're a good operator, you know what you're not the best at, you know what to sort of outsource, or, so you lean into your strengths, but you have to have this strategy stuff down, or else all the tactical stuff in the world is not going to make a difference. So step number 1, you have to know what your value proposition is. Sometimes this is called the USP, the universal selling proposition, universal value proposition. But this is a really basic question. As a real estate sponsor, as a fund issuer, a fund sponsor, what is it that you do, or that your fund or product does, that brings value? I mean, this should be the thing that you are best at. And you may not be the very best in the world at this, right? How many sponsors are there running multifamily funds? You may not have the very best multifamily fund in the world. That'd be a bold claim. But what's your niche? You might have the best multifamily fund with Class B properties, value add in Dayton, Ohio, or something very specific. So just understanding what your niche is, what you do better, what you do best, you have to start there and lean into your strengths.
That's interesting. So I get this question often about similar. It's like, and I actually made a note here, but then you talked about it, which is great. It's like, how do I stand out? There's so many that are so similar, right? Doing such a similar business plan. Well, people say, well, Whitney, there's so many other people doing exactly what I'm doing. How am I different from them, right? When I'm marketing. And so what do you say to that, Andy? Like, how do I stand out? If we got the same business plan as, a dozen other people, 20 other people, operators that we know. Any questions there that would help the listener to think through that?
Yeah, that's a great question. Well, first I'd start off with the quote, the riches is in the niches, right? So the more niche you can go, the more hyper specific you are about that value proposition, the easier it is to be the best at something, right? So I'd start there. But another thing I would say is, ultimately most real estate is a commodity, right? At the end of the day, Class A multifamily in Brooklyn is Class A multifamily in Brooklyn. And when you look at the fixtures, when you look at the floor plans, in some ways, the more commoditized, the better. A lot of times the real estate market will punish you for being too fancy or too, out there with those sorts of sticks and bricks types things. But everyone has their own secret sauce. This could be your personality. It could be, the way you think. It could be just as an operator, just little differentiators, the things that make you, you. And again, here's the thing. It doesn't have to be the best, but if you know who you are, you're going to resonate with a specific type of person. And you may turn off 99% of people, but then there's going to be that 1% that will be turned on by what you have to say. And that actually brings me to my next step, which is just identifying that ideal client. And to me, you want to know who your ideal client is, your ideal customer, your ideal investor. They should be that specific person who's looking for your exact product, your exact value proposition. And I think of note, the more you try and please everyone, or the more you try and appeal to everyone, you are really just setting yourself up for failure, because it's impossible to differentiate yourself that way.
Well, okay, we've talked about how to, value proposition. You even talked about if you can be hyper specific, it's easier to be the best at that thing. Makes so much sense. Do we know who our ideal client is? And then you just mentioned they're looking for our exact product, right? So what about having numerous products, or maybe we are buying those Class A projects in Brooklyn, but we're also doing some self-storage in Phoenix.
Mm-hmm.
Is that a thought, or is that getting too spread out? What's your thoughts behind, or is it's almost like running two separate businesses to some degree, right?
Well, that is a great question. I would say, let's say you had multifamily in Brooklyn and self-storage in Arizona. I forget your exact examples, but let's just take those two segments. So from a branding perspective, if you have a secret sauce that, whether it's operational efficiency, or maybe you're using machine learning and proprietary algorithm to locate attractive opportunities in different real estate sectors, maybe that secret sauce, that unique value proposition, is being applied to multiple sectors. So you can tell that same story, and it's going to work for each sector. At the same time, if you're executing two just totally different strategies that are not linked together in any way, shape, or form, they're probably going to require a different brand. And quite frankly, I'd also probably drill down even outside of marketing. Is one of those really your primary thing, the thing that you're better at? I might say focus on the thing that you're better at, because it's very hard, and I'll get to this later, but the more you complexify your story, the more you complexify your marketing and your product set, the harder it is to sell. It's much easier to sell something that is simple and that is easy to understand. So, and to be honest with you, that question leads me to the next step in this process. So, number one, what's your unique value proposition? Number two, who is your ideal client, right? Number three is you want to craft a very concise brand story. Okay. And I'm sure some of your listeners, Whitney, I don't know about you, if you're familiar with Donald Miller.
I am.
Story brand. Yeah. I mean, his stuff is amazing. So I'm not going to take credit for any of it. There's no need to reinvent the wheel. He's the master at teaching people how to do this. But in my experience, it doesn't even matter if you're a family office and you're managing $250 million AUM, or you're an accredited investor with $100K to place. At both ends of the spectrum, sure, you're going to look at the pro forma, you're going to do financial analysis, but it's really the story that pulls people in. And honestly, it doesn't matter the sophistication level of the investor. We had FTX in the news this week, right? That this crypto scam that they pulled, and how many people that they pulled in, and now, billions and billions of dollars that have evaporated. But why were they able to attract so many investors? Even because they had a story that people liked, right? So my point isn't that the financials don't matter. My point isn't that due diligence doesn't matter. But those things ultimately don't sell the offering. It's the story that sells the offering.
It's incredible. I think I like to think through what the story is. You mentioned like Donald Miller. I have heard of him. I looked at him years ago, but not a lot into his content, but I've always heard great things. Probably should look a lot more into it. But thinking about the story and how does it resonate with your client, like your story? Is there any thoughts behind like creating that story? Any tips on, helping the listener to think through their story and how to kind of put it in story format, who they are, their business, or any ideas behind that?
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I would say step 1, 2, and 3 really go together. So ultimately, your story needs to allude to your value proposition. And it should also be something that, resonates with that ideal client. So zooming out for a second, right? We already know our ideal client is an accredited investor, right? If you have a 506c fund, you're trying to raise capital from accredited investors. We already know they're an accredited investor. But let's say you have, for instance, a self-storage fund. Okay. You know that type of offering resonates with just a certain type of person. And realistically, if you're an operator in that sector, you are that type of person, right? There's probably a reason that you're in the self-storage sector. You don't want to deal with the 3 T's, toilets, tenants, and trash, or, those little bits and pieces of the folks who are involved in that sector. Those are going to resonate with your ideal client. So outside of like the investment niche, in fitness or in all these other big marketing verticals, a lot of times, marketers will talk about tribes, and tribes they'll have different beliefs, right? So if you're a CrossFit athlete or something, that's a tribe, right? There's certain beliefs that generally people who have, do CrossFit, they'll tend to have that sort of belief. So you really want to think about the sector of your product and your own secret sauce. So what makes you unique? What value add are you bringing? And then look at the context of what type of ideal clients are attracted to this sector. And your story, it should have a beginning, a middle, and an end of how my ideal client is going to succeed by investing in my fund, right? They're going to reach their goals in a way that resonates with them.
That's great. The beginning, middle, end of how they're going to reach their goal, thinking about how long, like if you're just verbalizing this story, is there a link that you would recommend or maybe a way to say, okay, we're going to have somebody's attention for this long or anything like that?
Well, first of all, I would honestly recommend everybody read Story Brand by Donald Miller.
Yeah.
Just go to his website and read that. He's the master there. But I will say this, and I'll get to this a little bit later in our conversation, I think, but complexity is your enemy. Okay. So let me give an example. One brand, one fund sponsor that I've interviewed on my show, I thought does this really, really well. Okay. They do have a self-storage fund, and their strategy is really simple. They're doing a roll up and they're buying assets in secondary markets. And then via basically a checklist, they have like a simple checklist to give them efficiency in owning and operating every asset. So efficient, operations, purchasing assets in that gap, in those secondary markets where the larger REITs aren't purchasing these assets, and then rolling them up because there's going to be multiple arbitrage at a certain, fund size. Once you get close to, $1 billion or whatever, the multiples go up. That is such a simple story. And to be honest, it's kind of boring. But when I heard it, it really resonated with me. I immediately understood it, and it was boring in a good way. Mm-hmm. So I think where a lot of owner operators fail with this is they might be good at something that's boring. That might be their edge. And then their story, it might be something like that self-storage fund that I just referred to. It's kind of a boring story. Every time you're pitching an investor, you tell the story over and over, you almost get bored with it, right? It's almost like, is this really going to work? It's almost too simple. But you have to put yourself in the shoes of the prospect, of the potential investor. Think about people in 2022, how much noise there is in our daily lives, right? Between text messages and social media and go, commute, Zoom calls, email, TV, Netflix, it's just nonstop noise, right? So for your message to break through, it really needs to be targeted towards that ideal client, right? It needs to allude to, that very specific thing that they're going to be interested in, and then keep it simple, right? Because if it's a story that takes 25 minutes to tell, I guarantee you've lost them. You should basically be able to give this elevator pitch in 30 or 60 seconds. And then if an investor wants to get on a call with you or learn more, then sure, you can give them that presentation. But even that, it should basically be 10 minutes, 15 minutes. If it takes you 30 minutes to explain your offering or 50 slides to explain your offering, it's probably not a very cohesive story that's going to resonate with a lot of people.
Yeah, boring is good in our business in many ways, right? If you're investing, boring is good.
Absolutely. Think of some of the most successful corporations in the world, global corporations, McDonald's, Costco, Walmart, in a lot of ways, they're boring, and maybe even they're in a commoditized niche, but they found their formula and they stuck to it. And then they had a simple but powerful brand story that they told over and over. And so that's really step 4. So where are we here? Let me review what we have so far. Start simple, find your value proposition, right? Number 2, who's your ideal client? Number 3, tell your brand story. Number 4 is, and this scares people. You want to tell that brand story over and over and over with content marketing, right? What's content marketing? Well, you and I are doing it right now, right? On this podcast, telling your story through content, whether it be a podcast, whether it be a video, whether it be webinars, whether it be a post on LinkedIn or Facebook, whether it be publishing research reports, whether it be email newsletter, blog post. There's a million ways that you can do content marketing, right? And that's essentially publishing information on, your sector that's going to appeal to that ideal client. And really, you're just kind of telling your story over and over in kind of micro doses and in different ways over and over and over. My big thing with this, though, is you tell an owner operator, not only do you have to do marketing, you have to do content marketing. You have to publish content consistently, indefinitely. For most owner operators, for most, fund sponsors, that even just saying that might give them a heart attack, right? But the key is this, that lean into your strengths, right? Like for me, appearing on a podcast, appearing on a video, it's pretty easy. I like to talk, especially if I'm passionate about a topic. I like to talk, but if I have to sit down and write something, a lot of times it's like pulling teeth. Some people are the total opposite. Some people, they love to dive into research and publish research. So it's okay to lean into what you're good at. You do not have to do everything. You don't have to be on every channel. If you don't like Facebook, you don't want to be on Facebook, you don't have to be on Facebook, right? So this is my big thing. The tactics, they are important, right? I'm not saying that the tactical marketing stuff is unimportant. I just think people can get scared off by it without seeing that big picture.
Yeah, no, I couldn't agree with you more. And I'm a prime example of telling this story over and over and over, over 1,500 episodes now. And so many people have learned about us and, just it's built so much credibility by telling the story over and over and over. So it can completely relate.
Yeah. Can I ask you a question?
Sure.
Okay. So my podcast, we're on episode like 75 or something like that, and I'm proud of making it that far. But what I want to ask you, your show's been around for so long and it's so successful. How much of that do you attribute to being unique and having that story? And how much do you attribute to sticking it out and being willing to just publish content over that long period of time? Because I think a lot of success just comes from that sort of attitude of not giving up.
Yeah, I would say it's some of both of those things, but the massive consistency over time has built so much credibility. It's allowed us to get in front of so many people. And I share this often. I get the question so often, has it been worth it to do a daily show? Because it's cost a fortune, yes, and it has taken so much time and energy. I just can't even express, oh my goodness, the amount of time that's gone into it. Yeah. But I was just sharing this in Puerto Rico actually last week. I was getting asked this at a conference, and I say, okay, the first year of the podcast, nobody knew who I was. The second year of the podcast, at the same time, I'm going to a bunch of conferences, right? First year at these conferences, nobody knew who I was. The second year of the podcast, everybody at the conferences or a lot of people knew who I was. By the third year, I'm speaking at the conferences, right? So, you can think about that transition. And I say, well, if you looked at a profit and loss for our podcast, you'd say, what in the world are you doing? This is the craziest thing. You need to stop this right away. It's costing so much. And however, if you look at also the trajectory of our business, it's obvious that it's right in line with that, it's helped us to move very fast, but it's built that credibility. It's allowed me to tell my story every day, practically, right? And people to hear my voice every day. Over, a few years now, every day. Right. So no doubt, it has been something I've had to just push forward and keep, there's days I was doing 12 to 15 interviews in one day, back to back to back. And so it's just, it's been a grind, no doubt about it, but I have had to be willing to just keep pushing forward no matter what.
Yeah. So, I mean, that's what you're doing, that consistent content marketing. So I'm obviously preaching to the choir with that. And obviously you've had huge success with that. And I think that's the daunting thing is, the idea that I'm going to have to do this indefinitely. But that's why, I really preach, lean into your strengths. If you like to write, if you like to be on video, be on video. Obviously, you enjoy podcasting a little bit, or you don't totally hate it, right? Or you
You know,
wouldn't be willing to
I would
podcast.
share there though that like I don't know that I had spoken into a microphone twice in my life before starting a podcast. So it doesn't have to be this thing that you're already just amazingly good at, right?
Mhm.
It's I knew it was a way to make this happen, and so I just had to lean into it and said, you know what, I'm going to do it. I'm going to go figure it out. And obviously, you know, it got easier over time. You know, the first 20. You won't get to the 30th show unless you start the first one, right? So you got to get started sometime. And you're going to get better at it. But I wouldn't say it was definitely a strength even of mine then. But I just had to lean into it and say, hey, we're going to make this happen.
Absolutely. So in the 6-step process, okay, now we're assuming you're publishing content regularly, right? You know your unique value proposition, you know your ideal client, you have that brand story, you're doing content marketing regularly. Enter the funnel, right?
That's right.
It's not enough to tell that story over and over. You're going to attract people, but you need to give them that structured process to build a relationship with them, right? Because usually a client doesn't go from, I've heard your name, I've heard about your product. Okay, here's a check for $250,000. I want to be an LP in your fund, right? There's usually a lot more steps in the sales and marketing process than that. And so what the funnel is, I mean, I'm guessing most of your listeners and viewers are familiar with, how funnel works. But one key point here that I like to preach is just like with the content marketing, your funnel can be built around your strengths, right? So obviously you want to have an email list, right? There's a lot of different ways to build a funnel, but I think most people who have been in this game for a long time would tell you that, the money's in the list. You definitely want to do email marketing. So the question is, how do I get folks onto my email list? And there's so many different ways, right? You could have a newsletter. You can offer webinars, free webinars that, require email to register. You can offer a lead magnet. That's kind of the classic bribe, is some sort of research report or guide to your sector or your market. And, you can even test out all kinds of different lead magnets. But this is really important because if you're doing content marketing, you're telling your story, hopefully, dozens, then hundreds, then thousands of people every month are hearing it. You want to give them that next step, which may not be investing with you right away, but that next step to engage with you to get onto your email list. So Whitney, I don't know what your funnel looks like, but honestly, in the real estate world, they're all over the map. And as far as where I sit, I think that's okay. Because again, it's about leaning into those strengths.
Yeah, I would say that this is where I did really poorly for a long time, too long, especially as much effort as we put into the podcast. But I was still working full time with the JOB while doing a daily podcast and going to conferences and started doing deals. And, it's like I didn't have time to be the entire marketing department as well. So it was like podcasts, we're getting people in the door, and then it's just cold, right? There's like not much happening after that for too long. But I agree. There's got to be some, that lead magnet, or that thing that's like adding value to them, right? So they want to stick around, and then they just build more trust, right? And so they want to engage with you more.
Yeah, absolutely. And that brings me to my last step. So we're presuming, you're doing the content marketing, you have your email list. It doesn't need to be complicated. I think MailChimp has plans from, $9 a month or something. But that last part, really important. You want to engage with your list regularly, right? It's pointless. It's a colossal waste of money, effort, and time to put all this time investment into content marketing, generating leads for your list. And then once they're on your list, you don't do anything with them. And unfortunately at AltsDB, this is something we see, because we do work with fund sponsors to generate investor leads, who are raising capital for their fund. And they'll put all this effort, time, and money into getting leads into their funnel. And then once the leads are into their funnel, it's kind of like, oh, shoot, what do we do now? You need to have a plan, to follow up, right? That's where the real money is made in the follow-up. There's multiple levels there, right? You can have an automated drip campaign with your email system. And you can also, regularly blast everyone, do a monthly webinar, do a quarterly report, just communicate regularly, because a lot of times what we've seen is funds will get an investor lead onto their list, And that investor, a lot of times, if they're going to close, they might close within 7 days. But most folks, they're not going to write a check right at that time due to cash flow, or, for instance, with DSTs, 1031 leads, if they don't have that, ticking time clock to do their 1031 exchange, they may not really be a warm, hot lead right now. But at some point in time, then they might be ready. So you have to communicate with them regularly. You have to build that relationship. You have to give them those opportunities to ascend, using the marketing speak, to ascend up that value ladder and ultimately make that investment. So that's really, really important. It's a lot more expensive to generate a new lead, like with AdWords or paid media, versus to communicate with an existing lead.
Yeah. I think you hit the nail on the head there, even at the end. We spend so much time getting new leads in, right, with the podcast and, with numerous avenues. But then we get them in and we spend almost no time like nurturing them, like you're talking about. And what I've learned and I've heard from a lot more people recently is like, okay, well, instead of, spending, twice as much money on SEO or ads or whatever, well, what if we took some of that and put it towards nurturing the leads that we already have, right? These people have already signed up. They're already interested. Why aren't you like working on that a little bit? So we've done that as well, and tried to transition. And unfortunately, Andy, we are running low on time, and I'd love to like continue this, keep talking about it, because I feel like it's questions that so many have. But I do want to get your opinion though on something before we move to a few final questions. And that is outsourcing, versus in-house, like the marketing piece. What do you recommend? Using a third-party marketing company as your like marketing arm, or should we have somebody in-house that's, heading most of that up? That's the marketing quote, expert, or how do you see that working best for most operators?
That's a great question. I mean, we mainly work with funds, right? Private equity real estate funds who are raising between 10 million and 250 million generally in assets for their fund. So partially it's a question of scale, right? So, at the larger end of that range, $250 million fund, typically that kind of fund is more likely going to have a chief marketing officer, or director of investor relations. But a lot of times, even on those larger funds in the 506c world, it is still the CEO that is doing a lot of the marketing. I mean, I really think that marketing, it's one of those things. I would say this. Absolutely, you can outsource what either you hate doing or it's not your strength, right? So you may say, I want to do a podcast or I want to do webinars, but I don't really understand AdWords. And so I'm going to hire out the AdWords. Like, that's okay. I think what the risk is, though, is when you try and just outsource the entirety of your marketing. I think that can be a problem because in my experience, ultimately, marketing and sales and investor relations, those three functions really tie together, right? Because if you're telling a certain story, a brand story with your marketing, and then you get onto that sales call where you're talking with that accredited investor or financial advisor, you want the sales pitch to really mirror that existing brand story that they've heard, that existing pitch that they've heard, because if it's incongruent or inconsistent, that's not going to facilitate trust or facilitate an ultimate investment. So I would say you can definitely hire out professional help, people that are experts in specific functions. You can even hire an expert to help you develop that brand story. And that might be money very well spent. But I don't think it's something that you can just check this off your list and say, I've hired a marketing agency, so I don't need to think about marketing anymore. I think that would be setting yourself up for failure.
Appreciate that insight. Yeah, it's not just a fix all, right? Okay, I've got this person hired, this company. Yeah, that's great. Andy, unfortunately, we got to move to a few final questions. But what about some habits that you are disciplined about that have produced the highest return for you?
That's a great question. Honestly, I would almost punt that back to you and say, witness what this podcast that I'm appearing on has done, just the consistency. I mean, this really marketing, we talked about the strategy, but once you have the strategy, now you need to build that system, right? It needs to be that type of thing, not necessarily on autopilot, but if I'm publishing content, if I'm telling my brand story, I need to have a way to do it over and over and over and over again consistently. Now, you've set the example of publishing a podcast every single day. I do not think that's realistic for most people. I mean, kudos to you. Absolutely. That's awesome. But, it's okay to have a podcast that publishes once a month,
Right.
or to have a research report or newsletter, even that's quarterly. It's not so much that, frequency, it's more communicating what the frequency is and then actually delivering. It'd be better to have a quarterly newsletter that goes out on time and it's consistent than to overpromise the weekly newsletter and to do it, 4 or 5 weeks in a row and then give up.
Yeah. People always ask about the daily show, or they, if they're wanting to do one. And my first question is, are you married? Do you have kids? If their answer is yes, I'm like, okay, let's talk about this a little bit. It may not be the best option for you, because it's going to be so intense, right? To keep it going. But it is about systems. You mentioned that it was about setting up a team. It was still extremely intensive for me, but and still is to some degree. But I've never edited the first piece of audio or video personally, and don't even know how and don't want to. So I'd say you have to have systems and help, right? What about, Andy, the number one thing that's contributed to your success?
I think it's passion and working in a space that actually interests me. Because if you're an entrepreneur, any entrepreneur listening to this, I don't care if you're a multi-billionaire, I'm pretty sure you would agree with the idea that there's going to be highs and there's going to be lows, right? It's not generally, it doesn't look like that straight 45-degree up and to the right type path with any business, with any venture, with any fundraise, with any capital raise. There's going to be ups and downs. So being in a business that you are actually passionate about, actually enjoy, that you want to be in, I think that can help get you through the lows. And I think ultimately a lot of the people who are successful just didn't give up, right? So you're whether we're talking about marketing or just business in general, there's going to be tough times. So I think, I've been involved in businesses before that I wasn't passionate about, and those tended not to work out. And it's been the ones where I was, the business niche that you think about or read about at 9:00 at night, that's going to be the niche that you're more likely to stick with and succeed in.
Yeah, that's interesting. The one you're reading about at 9:00 at night, you're staying awake for it, right? You're not falling asleep while you're reading about it. That's a neat way to measure that. Andy, how do you like to give back?
Business wise, I think with content marketing, it's almost built in that you have to be willing to share a lot of your best insights and just put them out there free of charge, because they build trust. And it's really, I think it's almost counterintuitive to people that I'm going to share my secret sauce, my business's secret sauce out there publicly and talk about it. But the reality is most people, they're not going to have the initiative, even if you give them your playbook on a silver platter with every single detail, basically gift wrap for them to follow. They're not going to go out and execute that playbook, right? You're the person who gets up every morning at 6 a.m. and executes that playbook. So I think in business, just content marketing is kind of built in. As far as otherwise, through my church, through charitable giving, I think that's important, that regardless of the business that you're in, you have to have something that motivates you besides just money, right? I mean, money, it's a kind of a measuring stick, an objective measuring stick for business success. But it's obviously it's not ultimately what life is about. And I don't think it really motivates most people, to get up at 6 a.m. or to be reading about it at 9 p.m. You're reading about that area that you do business in because you can't sleep. So I think that kind of passion, motivation, that kind of zoomed out thinking is really important for success.
For sure. Yeah, no doubt. We can be generous with the things we've learned, and because it does build credibility and it teaches other people. But like you said, most won't take advantage of it, unfortunately. Yeah, I want to help you, but you got to be willing to put the time in, right? And on that note, Andy, I'm grateful for your time today. So thankful for your generosity and being willing to even go through the step-by-step process. But there's a part there where, hey, you're putting all this out there, right? It's what we were just talking about. You've given us this step-by-step process, but the listeners and myself, we have to take the time to implement, right? And to really think. And I tell people that's the hard work, right? Is to think, like sit down, turn your phone off, turn your notifications off on your email, whatever, so you can think through this step-by-step process that Andy just went through. And how are you doing in that in your business? And take the time to make this happen, because that's where you're going to stand out, right? A year later or 2 years later, is because you took the time to put this plan in place and to think about this. Andy, thank you so much for your time today. How can the listeners get in touch with you and learn more about you?
Absolutely. Well, our website is altsdb.com. We have an investor event coming up, the Alts Expo on December 8th. So you can learn more about that at altsdb.com/expo. Or if you're into podcasts, absolutely open up iTunes or Spotify and just search alternative investment. We are the Alternative Investment Podcast, and we'll pop up number 1 or number 2 for that search. So.
Thank you for being with us again today. I hope that you have learned a lot from the show. Don't forget to like and subscribe. I hope you're telling your friends about the Real Estate Syndication Show and how they can also build wealth in real estate. You can also go to lifebridgecapital.com and start investing today.